So yeah, we won't do long intros, but we will have Nick, head of governance at Jito, Jaya from NIM, Aidan from ChainSafe, and Hudson from Polygon. And yeah, so yeah, I think Aidan will get the conversation going, and then just enjoy these people's opinions for the next 25 minutes.
Thank you so much, Jacob.
Thanks.
And thanks everyone for being here. Today we're gonna just have a conversation about how things have changed from our perspective over the last decade, some a little bit more, that we've been specifically in the Web3 space, and maybe what got us here, and yeah, just have a conversation and see what happens.
Oh yeah, thanks so much for the intro on that. One thing I guess I'll bring up at first for this topic is I always feel like, because I've been in crypto since like 2011 roughly, and everything seems to operate in cycles and not just economic ones, where there is like bullishness and bearishness and like builders really coming out in full force and then maybe being distracted by, you know, some of the money and economic and token stuff. And that's the biggest takeaway whenever they said that this talk was going to be about this, is like me thinking about all of this in cycles and seeing like, well, is there an analog to this in the real world or into other movements maybe? So I know that you two might have some context on this.
Yeah, I think one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is I see crypto as a kind of microcosm. It's a parallel reality that we kind of inhabit that's being non-state. It's a kind of like little bubble. And it does sort of play out what happens in the real world on faster timescales. There's like definitely that we just make everything moves at like there's crypto speed moves at like 4x the pace to the real world, and we just speed run almost like we have boom and bust cycles in the real world. They're just on like generally over a couple of decades, or like you have one or two a generation. But in crypto, we just do it like much quicker. So yeah, I think that I don't actually think we're that special. I just think it's that it's more volatile, and it's a frontier thing, right? It's like this is the leading edge of a technological paradigm, and we're just exposed to the future a little bit quicker. In a way, we're just a little bit in the future.
When the kind of invitation came a couple of hours ago to join this panel, I was thinking a little bit about you know, this kind of idea of talking about the core values of crypto, and I could sense kind of for myself that like part of me doesn't care, if I'm going to be completely honest, in the sense that like we've arrived at a moment in global and geopolitical and economic developments where there is just like so much real need for things that work and solve real problems for real people. So I'm just somehow like less interested in the kind of boom and bust cycles of crypto per se, as I'm interested in, you know, can this space actually meet some of these needs and like step up to that finally, or are we going to continue in this kind of circular conversation internally, a circular conversation that's fueled by the fact that, you know, we can print money, and it's kind of like that is both like an interesting thing, but it's also the kind of thing that holds the whole space back from finally graduating to, you know, a real world set of needs and requirements, which is, you know, really where we're at right now. Yeah.
Yeah, so just to maybe assert some conclusion based on what everyone has said, and please disagree if you don't agree. Maybe the values haven't really changed. Maybe, you know, this kind of was always the thing, and a lot of people were kind of approaching this technology from a very, you know, greed-oriented approach, and a lot of people did believe in some kind of peer-to-peer future. And I think, you know, maybe there's just a lot more people now. A lot of people have been in the space for a significant amount of time now. And so in a lot of ways, maybe people's own feelings and own kind of projections are coming out onto the entire industry as a whole. Because from my perspective, there's always been nefarious and longer term kind of values that have been obvious amongst us. And I think that that's a huge part of any industry. And yeah, I don't necessarily think we move at hyperspeed. I think, maybe TVLs grow in hyperspeed, but that doesn't mean we're moving at hyperspeed. And so I think it really depends how you're measuring that growth, how you're measuring that evolutionary change that allows us to kind of categorize it as one versus the other. So yeah, I'm just curious, how do you all feel about this notion that, there is still all the good happening, and there is also all the bad happening?
I mean, yeah, well, I would definitely agree that like I don't think a whole lot has changed. Like I remember, super early days, Bitcoin, and also the very first Ethereum DevCon, I think in the city of London. And I remember looking around the room back then and thinking, this is such a weird gathering of people. And everybody here has their own mental model of what decentralization means, and it's not the same thing. Like, it's just not the same thing. And even when it comes to this topic of, like, are you there for the greed or not? Like, I think a lot of people were there for the question of like, re-engineering economic dynamics. And I think that is interesting. Like, for me, I was attracted to that. Like, I was involved in decentralized tech before then. But what we saw was also that, like, a lot of the problems in both decentralized technology, but also in the question of privacy and the question of surveillance, it was a question of political economy as well. So the fact that here was a proposal to not just kind of, build some tech and then the economics kind of floats on the outside, but actually start to think the two in like together was an interesting proposition. But again, the kind of like types of economics that each of us kind of ascribed to was always very, very different and conflictual. And that's still playing out in the space today, right? I would say that maybe some of my favorite strands of economics has not, necessarily like won so much in the space. But I wonder if that is like due to the space itself or more due to the kind of surrounding economic dynamics and the fact that, like, if you want to do markets differently, well, and you're in a kind of regulatory environment and a kind of market environment that doesn't allow for that, the struggle is not like to kind of redesign the protocol. The struggle is actually somewhat elsewhere. So I wouldn't kind of blame it necessarily on kind of like us, let's say, but more just that, actually the conversation is much bigger.
I think you said something then interesting that it's like, yeah, this is evident here, right? That the same values are still there and arguably on a greater scale. Like, if anything, the core values of what we were trying to build in Ethereum and even the cypherpunk movement before that are still very present in spaces like this, and it's bigger. And I do think it just feels like it's lost its way because the real industry at scale that exists around this is still a small bubble within the bubble. And I certainly envisaged that this bubble would be the bubble in the future, and it's not, right? It's I think what you just said then, Jaya, about it being, I see crypto as a kind of, I said that I posted something not long ago, an article I called The Crypto Trap, which was about, it's a riff on a documentary by Adam Curtis called The Trap, which is about a story about game theory. And he sort of follows Nash's sort of work, and this is the non-collaborative Nash equilibrium that holds Bitcoin together, permeates itself through the whole space. And there's like this kind of, there's a game that Nash created called Fuck You Buddy. And the goal is to collect tokens in a game and build alliances with people around the board and then screw them. And then your job is to collect all the coins. And that's what we've got on this scale, like across the industry is like brutally zero sum at structural levels. Like the market is cornered. Getting to market without being captured or screwed is like so incredibly difficult that it has a kind of what I call an inverse value filter, which is like the stuff that makes it to market is all this extractive garbage that's just like there to extract from retail participants maximally. I think that's what we're upset about.
Yeah.
The core values are still there. And you're right, it moves actually quite slow. When I came into crypto like several years ago now, I expected it all to happen next year. Like I wanted to like get out of academia so desperately, and I was like, because I thought I was going to miss the boat. Like I thought it's all going to like happen at speed of light, and I'm going to miss it. And actually, we're basically even in some ways behind where we were in 2018. We've done a lot of scaling blockchains, but none of the actual like social layer stuff that I thought was interesting.
Yeah, I when Aidan, when you were talking about how has it just stayed the same, it made me start thinking deeper about cypherpunk values, and it made me realize cypherpunk values breeds paranoia. If you have cypherpunk values, you're going to be paranoid, and I think you're going to be paranoid about these things that you hold so dearly being upended by the systems we're trying to destroy. And so, because of that, I think even if things have stayed the same, like I just have this little like watcher on. Like, is someone going to come in and like, you know, like delegitimize this whole thing? Are they going to come in and change the values? And you're right, they really, at least at this core little bubble we have, they haven't. And maybe that's what's permeating through the rest of the stuff that we can't see. So yeah, I was just going to say like, oh, it's not that like I'm thinking about it wrong. I'm just paranoid, so I'm thinking about it naively.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. And I definitely struggle with that same paranoia. And yeah, I think, as people who are trying to fight an adversarial world, even though we don't necessarily struggle with that adversity that we're looking to help, or at least all of it. We do get trapped in this adversarial thinking, and that the hope originally was that this isn't zero sum, at least for me, that these were more about positive sum games, basically, that we could learn to create for society and see where that goes. But to your point, social things really have not grown in the way that we wanted them to, or at least, things like ETFs and others, which I'm not talking shit about, but those have been kind of like the social improvements in terms of how regular people have gotten into the space. And that's, definitely not what I expected.
Yeah, the state sorting us out is not really what the idea was, right? The idea was that we were going to build. Yeah, and I think that kind of point around non-zero sumness being a driving function. Certainly, a lot of the people that I've sort of got to know for years over in crypto is that we're trying to build a system that is materially different to the current system, whatever that might be. It's just not that, right? There's a definite value of sort of like rejecting the status quo in terms of both sort of economic power and political power and how everything is structured out in the real world. All of this offered a material alternative, and that is what I found so exciting about it. When I first I was teaching cryptography in like 2011, discovered Bitcoin very early, but it wasn't until the DAO as an academic, like you just look at these things theoretically, but the DAO moment was made me think this could be like globally transformative. It could really change the way that we structure society and organizations and everything, top to bottom. But yeah, now you're right about the paranoid thinking. But I think we have to be a little bit paranoid because a lot of what I've come to realize is that was a bit of idealism, like for sure. And having your idealism crushed in crypto is one of the hardest experiences to go through. But everyone seems to go through it, right? You come with these wonderful ideals and then they get smashed to bits. But now if we don't steer it towards, like this is why values are important, if you like, is because they can set the direction of travel for the industry and allow us to steer away from particular outcomes. There's ways that this technology gets used to create far worse. It's not just that we didn't make the world a better place, it's that we made it materially worse. Like that's the bit that like really worries me, to be honest.
I mean, I don't know. I have so many things to say about that. I mean, the DAO, it was an interesting moment, but when I had the exact opposite reaction when the DAO happened to you.
Interesting.
I was like, okay, this is, this is there was to me, it was the kind of like, uh, it was the perfect thing to happen in a sense, because it kind of showed that you can't get rid of politics, right?
Mm.
And that was like the first thing that I noticed about the crypto space was like there was this almost like a kind of like, I mean, very like in a sense cute sentiment where it was like, goddamn, the state has done so many bad things, and like if only we can kind of replace it with something, rational and clean like technology, like a blockchain, and then we'll get rid of all this messy stuff. And the DAO was like the epitome of like trying to do that, but just completely forgetting the fact that it's like, you might disagree, at the level of the code itself, right? And it's like who governs the code, and you don't
Yep.
get away from the question of politics. You just reconfigure, the conditions for politics to be enacted from a kind of like parliamentary process and a legal process into a process of like Git, effectively. From my perspective, Git is still the governance software for like the entire space. Like,
Yeah.
and it's not something that people talk
That's
about much,
true.
but that's basically what happens. So yeah, for me, it was like the DAO was more like a kind of like, okay, good. This space is going to have to kind of realize that you can't just rewrite things carte blanche into technology and everything gets solved, and that actually, speaking of this kind of like speed rehearsal of things that does happen in the space, like what's happened is like the space kind of like relearned why the state exists and relearned why there's financial regulation and relearned like all these things that already kind of to some extent has been negotiated historically over time with our existing institutions. And that sucks, right? I mean, it sucks to have to relearn that and realize, oh, damn, okay, there's a reason why we're stuck with these monstrous institutional frameworks that are malfunctioning in all sorts of ways, but there's not such a simple, easy fix, actually.
Yeah.
And in some ways, the legacy institutions that we sit with are also legacy institutions that have an immense, like, historical, like, record, let's say, of past struggles, right? Where and that also needs to be honored, right? Like, there's a lot of things in the regulatory frameworks that in some parts of the world that are really, they were fought with blood, sweat, and tears by people who had, real struggles to, gain rights and win rights and have those rights inscribed in the legal frameworks that we live with. So, yeah, for me, and it's not to say that I'm kind of like, I love the existing institutions. It's clear that they're failing.
Yeah.
But it's also clear that, there's not an easy technical fix to those questions, to the question of politics.
Yeah, I mean, we need strong institutions. Like the institutions are the fabric of society. We need more institutions, if anything. But they are all. Society's got more complex. There's an idea in governance called the law of requisite variety, which is the governance system that you are using to govern something should be at least as complex as the system that you're governing. You try to govern a system that's more complex than your governance system is capable of, it will collapse. And what's happening is that the institutions are trying to deal with a world that's now heavily globalized and like non-linearly more complex than it ever has been. But we haven't upgraded the way that we govern ourselves for decades. It's like the governments are still running the same way they were 100 years ago.
I would argue that we've learned a lot in the last 100 years in terms of how modern democracies ought to be. And we have a clear idea of what a democratic socialist society can look like. Whether or not that scales, we have yet to see, but I would to say that in the last 100 years,
is manifesting.
there's a few different places around the world, but like obviously Scandinavian countries would probably be the best example. But again, we haven't seen that scaled yet. But I think there's been interesting stuff like even mandatory voting in Australia. Like there's a few different small scale experiments where we've seen the growth of democratic systems into a new form. But I think it's important. Yeah, like I am a person that would maybe not be alive if it wasn't for certain democratic institutions making sure that I'm still alive for a few different reasons. And so I think it's really important that we acknowledge that, yeah, especially like all the movements for people's rights over the last 100 years have changed things completely. But going back to kind of some of the points made earlier, I think the real enemy, and I think we could all agree, is technocracy, right? Is this idea that we think just building for the sake of building is going to solve society's problems. And it sounds like we're all kind of in agreement there that as technologists, being anti-technocracy is almost like a hypocritical way of living.
What's your definition of technocracy?
Technology solving problems.
Oh, okay.
The idea that we can just keep on building to solve our problems. And it's if I just build one more thing, if I just get free energy for all, then all the world's problems will go away.
I thought you meant technocracy, like technical people in positions of leadership governing. Because yeah, that's how I feel the core devs are right now. Because like they put the code in, and so yeah, Ethereum's a technocracy.
I disagree heavily. I definitely think that they
It
follow
is.
a lot more
Bitcoin's the
social
ultimate
things.
technocracy.
Like if they were in control, we would be in a different place.
Yeah, my thing is they listen to the community, and they're altruistic all day long, and we have safeguards so that like bad people can't get in there. But it is still a technocracy. It's just not a bad technocracy. I love it.
We can agree to disagree. But yeah, I would love to. We don't have much time left. Are we doing questions, Jacob, or no? Okay. Yeah, perfect. Perfect. So yeah, I don't know if anyone wants to have any final thoughts.
Yeah, I think really the central question was like about the values of Web3, right? I think we just need to find what they are and stick to them. I think we are adrift without really, we're still talking about, is it cypherpunk values, is it this, that, and the other? I think we've just got to get better at aggressively supporting the things that we know are good and being a bit more vocal about rejecting the things that are bad. There's this dynamic where people are holding some token and then they're scared about flooding other people's bags because it's like, no, if it's bad, we should be more not crypto skeptical, but crypto critical. We need to get better having critical discourse about what the nature of this technology is, and having more leadership and trying to guide the system like into positive directions and just speaking out when things are bad.
Yeah, to me, like, yes, values are important. Values as they're thought through in terms of, how they benefit people in the real world even better. So I think like it's super important to have, and there's also a difference between values and kind of maxims, right? So like I think in the kind of like cypherpunky Web3 kind of attempt to define some values, there are these ideas of decentralization and privacy and so on and so forth, which like, sometimes they can be almost like dogmas that actually blind people a little bit to like whether they're doing anything useful and good in terms of the actual effects of what they're building. And this for me is kind of like the key to really like actually start opening up the space towards like, becoming more aware of the context that we're operating in right now. And I think the context, like, technocracy is kind of like, that's like maybe a cute problem. Like techno-fascism is actually what I'm worried about right now. And that's where, people's rights in the real world are being destroyed at a very, very fast speed right now. And not just their rights, but also their lives in its entirety. So like being useful to, those real world needs and concerns right now is incredibly important. And it's also one of the reasons why, I work on the topic of privacy specifically, because I do think that has a lot of value at the moment. Yep.
Yep, privacy is incredibly important. I love that. I also, actually following on what you said, having these values, picking the values and following the values has to come with a balance of, having the values at all and pragmatism. And so like, if you're not actually helping anyone, but you're just having them, then it's just pure dogma like you were talking about, and that's shitty. So we don't really want to do that. So we need to balance like what these things do for actual real people and if we're moving toward that.
Yeah, thank you for that. And yeah, I totally agree. Techno-fascism is here. And that's really what you were describing, right? And we really need to take that seriously. And it came from within the space, right? A lot of the people who have really are there in the peripheries funding a lot of these things are quite literally techno-fascists. There's some people that I'll be happy to tell you about after if you come and find me. I don't want to give them a platform here. But yeah, there's some really scary stuff going on, and it isn't paranoia. This is really real, and we're seeing it play out in the world stage, led by people who helped fund the early days of this space.
Yep.
And so we need to be very, very honest about that and about what each and every one of us does with our lives, because we do have a power, we do have a privilege, and it must be used to fight this evil that we just watched from the sidelines be created right in front of us.
On that note. Yes. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much. And thank you for talking about something interesting, because you all have very pleasant voices. I could definitely have fallen asleep in my chair here. So this concludes the day on this stage. We have Gavin starting in 4 minutes in Cinema 10, so go and catch that one. Yeah, thank you very much for being here, and yeah, see you next year or whatever.